The municipal courthouse in Savannah buzzed with that strange kind of quiet that feels like a storm's about to roll in. People whispered in corners, nudged elbows, and adjusted ties that were already too tight. In a courtroom usually ruled by buttoned suits and rigid protocol, the entrance of a teenage boy sparked more than a few raised eyebrows and looks exchanged over the tops of glasses. Elias Thornton walked in like he knew where he was going. 17 years old, wearing jeans faded from real work and sneakers with soles flattened by time. His sweatshirt bore the logo of an old hardware store on Victory Drive, and his backpack looked like it had been through a few too many downpours. He didn't flinch when the deputy by the door waved a hand in confusion, nor when the clerk squinted at him, trying to figure out if he was just lost. Instead of heading to the gallery like most kids his age would, Elias made his way to the defense table. Several heads turned, a snort escaped from the back row, and up at the bench, Judge Franklin P. Ellis cracked the kind of grin that only came when he thought the universe was serving him entertainment with his morning coffee. Leaning forward with a voice that echoed just enough to keep everyone hooked, he said, "You bringing snacks for this trial, kid, or you planning to stay for recess too?" The courtroom broke into quiet chuckles. A few whispered something under their breath, but Elias didn't blush, didn't laugh, and didn't sit back down. He looked the judge in the eye and slowly set his notebook on the table. No folders, no assistants, just a lined notebook balanced on one knee. His hand rested on it like someone about to open a story only he had the full script for. Next to him, Marlene Cook, mid-50s, tired hands, and kind eyes dulled by disappointment, avoided eye contact with anyone. She was the owner of a small corner store across from Kay's laundromat, hard-working, fair, and broke. Now she was labeled a tax cheat. She barely breathed as the murmurs died down. Elias didn't need to speak yet. The courtroom thought they'd seen everything. But the moment he sat down, shoulders squared and eyes scanning the room like it was already a chessboard, the old rhythm of the place shifted. Officially, the trial hadn't started. But for Elias, the fight already had. The courthouse was still letting out when Elias slipped through the side entrance and headed up Liberty Street, weaving past cafes, setting out chairs for the lunch crowd, and retirees walking little dogs on braided leashes. While everyone else chewed on gossip about the kid lawyer with the stone face, Elias just kept his head down. His place wasn't far. A small second-floor apartment above a used bookstore that smelled like rain and old paper. No one gave him a second glance as he unlocked the dented red door and stepped inside. The apartment didn't reflect his age. No posters, no clutter, no loud colors. Instead, one wall was completely covered in a homemade investigation board. Wires crisscrossed from one torn newspaper clipping to another. Highlighters marked names and dates. A few faded Polaroids of courthouse regulars were tucked between tax reports. It looked like something out of a detective show, but it wasn't for drama. It was for survival. He dropped his backpack, kicked off his sneakers, and went straight to the kitchen, if heating up instant macaroni counted as cooking. With the microwave humming behind him, Elias clicked open an old video file on his second-hand laptop. It was an archived interview from a local news channel, dated nearly 7 years earlier. Judge Franklin Ellis was younger back then, sharper, in his tone, speaking about ethics in public service. At first glance, it was nothing special, but to Elias, certain names dropped during the interview started pinging against pieces of his board, especially the one company leading the charge against Marlene, Valenbrook Procurement, LLC. The company had appeared clean, too clean. Elias lined up records from the Georgia Business Registry, old invoices buried in city procurement reports, and a quiet donation to a civic legal fund that, according to his notes, connected tight with Judge Ellis's private foundation. Not illegal, but strange, especially because it had never been disclosed in any motion or conflict of interest filing. As he stirred watery cheese into the pasta, Elias paused, frowning at a gap in the timeline. There was a window in fiscal year reports where transactions spiked. That kind of jump should have raised eyebrows, but it hadn't, not until now. He wasn't doing this for headlines. He didn't even care about clearing his own name. What pulled him deeper was simple. If people like Marlene were getting crushed by a rigged system, someone had to pull at the threads of the lie, stitch by stitch, before the whole thing unraveled on more lives. The State Library of Georgia sat quietly on the edge of a busy block in downtown Savannah, shaded by oak trees, dripping with moss. The main doors stayed busy with students and researchers, but Elias always used the side entrance by the alley, the one with the chipped blue paint nobody bothered to fix. He knew the way without looking, slipping past rows of shelves lined with thick hardcovers and brittle folders, until he reached the back corner, where time seemed slower and the air tasted like paper and dust. Delilah Briggs was there, as she always was on Wednesdays. Though technically retired, she still showed up a few times a week, sorting old legal journals and sipping from a stained thermos labeled "Do Not Microwave." Most people ignored her. Young interns thought she was just a relic who talked too much. But Elias didn't. He knew Delilah had helped build the original filing system when half the city's court records shifted from boxes to microfilm. She looked up and smiled the moment she saw him, no surprise in her face. "Didn't think I'd see you this week," she said. "Thought you were off playing lawyer in the grown-up room." "I need to see the tax journals from the late 1980s, Elias said, already heading toward the stacks. "And anything related to the Wallenbrook group before it was called that?" Delilah raised one eyebrow. "Old ghosts, huh?" She stood up slowly, motioning for him to follow. "There's more truth buried in the dead files than you'll ever hear in that courthouse." They walked to a dusty room with no windows and a humming microfiche machine that stuttered when it started. There, surrounded by years of forgotten print, they flipped through legal gazettes and obscure reports. 2 hours in, Delilah pulled a folder half the size of a phone book. Folded inside was a yellowed clipping from a now-defunct local business. On paper, it mentioned a property transfer involving a shell corporation tied to the Ellis family. Quiet, discreet, but oddly timed, coinciding with early city contracts awarded to a firm that later became Wallenbrook. Elias stared at it for a long time. It wasn't proof, not yet. But it was a crack. A place where something false had been polished too neatly. Delilah leaned back, rubbing one temple. "Funny how things circle back, huh? You dig long enough, the ground remembers." Elias nodded without speaking. For him, the case had just shifted. This wasn't just mismanagement or bias anymore. This was bigger. Now he had a trail. The ballroom at the Savannah Convention Center buzzed with the kind of muted conversation that only money and power could produce. People in tailored suits held tiny plates of shrimp and toasted one another with glasses of overpriced Chardonnay. It was the closing reception of the Southeastern Corporate Law Association's private seminar, an invite-only event where deals were hinted at in whispers and favors were exchanged in plain sight. No cameras, no press, just quiet bragging dressed up to look like policy talk. Elias had gotten in the same way he got into most places, quiet, unnoticed, walking like he belonged there. His name tag read Eric Thompson, printed in small, bold letters, placed neatly above the word assistant. Nobody questioned it. In rooms like this, assistants blended into the wallpaper. He wore slacks borrowed from his neighbor Matthew, a blazer a size too big, and carried a fake portfolio that just held a notepad and an empty folder. No one even looked twice. He made his way slowly around the room, pretending to refill glasses, pretending to care. That's when Camden Holt stopped him. The guy had the energy of someone who'd never been told no. With a perfect smile and a family name carved on half a dozen courthouses, Camden was one of those up-and-coming legal stars everyone either resented or tried to impress. He assumed Elias was just another intern and invited him over, like you'd call for a waiter. "Man, I swear this place is crawling with nobodies," Camden said, sipping his drink. "But hey, you'll like this story. Confidential, of course." He leaned in, eyes already glossed from too many cocktails. What followed was a ramble of names, judges who owed favors, deadlines that had mysteriously shifted, audits dodged by switching firms at just the right moment. Camden laughed like it was a golf story, not a legal confession. Elias stayed stone-faced, nodding at just the right spots, mentally logging everything. When Camden finally asked, almost as an afterthought, "What's your name again?" Elias tilted his head and smiled. "E.T. liked the movie," he said. "Came from far away, heading back with something valuable." Camden chuckled, not knowing he'd just opened a new door without even realizing it. Elias turned to leave without a sound. He didn't need to sneak through the front anymore. He had just pulled one more thread from a sweater that was starting to unravel. Back at the Chatham County Courthouse, the mood was as stiff as ever. Elias sat 2 rows from the front in courtroom number 6, just behind Marlene and her court-appointed attorney. He kept his eyes on the proceedings and his mouth shut. On paper, he was just a silent observer, technically allowed in the room but without the right to speak or represent anyone. But everyone on Marlene's side of the aisle knew he wasn't just there to watch. Even the attorney, a nervous man named Greg Simmons, glanced at Elias during key moments, almost like he was waiting for a cue. The pretrial hearing moved slowly, focused on whether the evidence against Marlene was enough to move forward. Elias listened carefully, leaning forward as soon as the prosecutor, Judith Ramos, mentioned a confirmed submission dated September 12th, tied to the tax evidence. She pulled it up on a tablet, a simple digital form, time-stamped and validated. Most people would have accepted it without thinking twice, but something about it didn't sit right with Elias. It wasn't the date itself, but the fact that the software Ramos used wasn't standard state software. Elias squinted at the bottom of the screen and saw the name of a third-party filing tool he'd come across before, QuickCert Ledger. He remembered it from a side job he'd once done, helping a local non-profit fix their records. The tool wasn't inaccurate per se, but it had vulnerabilities, and Elias had studied those holes for weeks out of curiosity. Later that evening, back in his apartment, with a mug of reheated coffee and his laptop humming, Elias dove into the back-end language of QuickCert's filing system. After hours of sifting through code and archived packets, he spotted the tampering. The metadata revealed fields filled days after the submission date, IP addresses disconnected from Marlene's location, and document IDs that didn't follow the usual sequence. Someone had edited the submission after the fact and tried to cover it up. He screenshotted everything, sorted the logs chronologically, traced IP logs to an office connected to Valenbrook. It was real. Digital fraud hiding inside a tax charge. But screenshots and system logs weren't enough for court. He needed a certified source to back it up, someone inside QuickCert or someone credible who'd vouch for what he'd found. That meant stepping out of the shadows he'd carefully stayed in. Elias knew that once he crossed that line, there was no uncrossing it. But if Marlene was going to stand a chance, he had to go all the way in, even if it meant she'd walk free while he burned. The email for the televised debate went out with fancy banners and gold script, inviting law schools and community members to the Savannah Center for Civic Discourse. Billed as Youth and Ethics in Modern Law, it sounded like another evening of polite dialogue and recycled speeches. What no one expected, especially not the faces seated in the front row wearing matching blazers, was that someone like Elias would be stepping behind the microphone. Delilah had signed him up without asking. "You'll thank me later," she had said, sliding the RSVP slip across the library counter while he stared at her in disbelief. Elias had considered backing out, but by the time he showed up backstage, the name tag just said E. Thornton Independent. Too late to walk away. He wore the same blue blazer from the legal seminar, still a little big on the shoulders, and slacks that barely passed inspection. His shoes were clean, though, and his notes were memorized. The crowd tilted toward the older side, alumni, retired judges, and a couple of high school teams sitting stiff with notebooks in their laps. When the moderator, a well-known law professor from Atlanta, read his name and motioned him forward, scattered chuckles rolled through the room, like someone had let the intern speak by accident. Elias reached the podium slowly, adjusting the mic with a calmness that didn't match his age. What followed wasn't a speech in the traditional sense. He opened by briefly referencing the basic framework of judicial ethics, then started threading together real examples, case patterns, unreported relationships, and procedural errors that benefited the same firms again and again. Some names dropped lightly, one or two too loudly for the room's comfort. He quoted canon law like someone who had been raised around it, not taught it in class. People stopped laughing. Pens stopped moving. About halfway through, a professor near the panel table stood and interrupted. "This is all very entertaining," he said, barely smirking. "Remind us, where exactly have you studied again, young man?" Elias didn't look flustered. He paused, nodded once, and gave a half-smile. "With the best," he said. "Some of them just forgot what they taught." There was a low murmur in the room. A few in the audience exchanged looks. One woman in the back clapped once, before catching herself. And just like that, the story of the kid in the borrowed blazer stopped being funny. It started being real. The sunset cast long shadows across the shipping yard just past the I-16 overpass, where tired diesel engines hummed like crickets. Elias stood near the chain-link gate, watching workers in steel-toed boots wheel pallets from the back of a long-haul truck. His brother Simon was among them, wearing a sweat-soaked t-shirt and moving like someone who was too used to hard labor to even think about it. Elias hadn't seen him in 4 months, maybe 5. Time had blurred. Simon noticed him before Elias could call out. His shoulders stiffened just a little, but he didn't wave or walk over. Instead, he kept unloading until the truck was empty, then unhooked his safety vest and tossed it on a crate. When Elias approached, Simon wiped his forehead with his sleeve and asked flatly, "What do you want?" Elias tried to smile, uncertain. "Can't it just be about dropping by, talking?" Simon let out a dry laugh. "Talk about what? Taxes? Court speeches? You want to teach me how to expose corruption between boxes of frozen seafood?" Elias looked down, shoving his hands in his pockets to steady his nerves. "I know we don't talk much. I messed that up. But I miss the way we used to figure stuff out together. I always thought we were a team. You were the one who helped me record my first mock trials. You fixed Mom's laptop when I was trying to learn case law at 13. "Yeah," Simon said, voice sharper now, "and I got to hear Dad ask if I'd ever be half as smart as you." His words hit like a punch, and Elias had no comeback. "Look, go save the world, collect your medals. I just don't want to be used for notes or dragged into your war." "I'm not," Elias said quietly. "It's about a delivery, a shipment to Marlene's shop, the week before the raid. I think it got altered in court records. You were the one who brought it, right?" Simon didn't answer at first, just stared past Elias toward his truck. Then finally, with a tired nod, he said, "I remember it. Maybe more than I want to." Elias didn't push. That soft shift in Simon's tone was enough, for now. The truth they were both circling had little to do with files or courts. Beneath the fight, beneath the bitter air, lived something harder to fix. Sibling wounds, left open too long. As Elias walked away, he knew the case wasn't the only thing he had to win. News of Judge Ellis's temporary removal spread faster than wildfire through the courthouse halls. By Monday morning, whispers had turned into full-on debates by the vending machines and outside the clerk's office. Most people wore neutral expressions, but anyone who'd been watching closely knew something big was shifting. Judge Clarice Donnell took over the bench the next day. She was well known in the Georgia legal sphere, not flashy, not political, and definitely not easy to sway. If Judge Ellis had ruled with a smirk and an agenda, Judge Donnell brought a stillness that made even the loudest attorneys quiet their voices. Elias arrived at the courthouse before sunrise this time. He didn't sleep much the night before. Marlene was already inside when he showed up, seated with her lawyer, Greg Simmons, in a side room. Her expression had changed. It was hard to explain, but there was more steadiness behind those tired eyes. When she caught sight of Elias through the glass, she managed a half-smile that said more than words could. For the first time, she looked like someone who might actually believe she could walk away from this. Inside the courtroom, the air felt different, less tense, more watchful. Judge Donnell took her seat with the same calm presence she was known for and began the hearing without ceremony. As the lawyers settled into place, Greg stood with measured steps and passed a sealed folder to the bailiff, evidence collected by Elias, handed over just as they had rehearsed. It contained the full printouts, the timestamp discrepancies, logs, showing edits days after official deadlines, and IP records that tracked all the way back to the Valenbrook offices. When Judge Donnell asked for clarification, Greg spoke briefly before requesting an official forensic review. The courtroom sat in an almost suspended silence before she nodded once and ordered an independent audit of the system in question. She didn't look surprised, just focused. From the prosecution's table, Camden shifted uncomfortably, casting a quick glance toward his co-counsel. His jaw tightened, and for the first time, the confidence he carried like cologne seemed to fade. Elias, seated quietly behind Marlene, watched this unfold. His hands were steady. This wasn't the finish line, not even close, but it was the first time in months that the fight didn't feel imaginary. Something real, the system, the law, had finally stopped pretending not to see. Rain patted lightly against the window panes that morning, grey clouds stretching out over downtown Savannah like a heavy blanket. Elias had just finished pouring lukewarm coffee into a chipped mug when he noticed something under his door. An envelope, thick and crooked, not like the usual ads or bills he sometimes stepped over. He dropped the mug on the counter and crouched down slowly. The envelope was a plain brown one with no name, seal or postage, just his unit number scribbled in black ink. Inside was a typed letter, short and unsigned. No greeting, no goodbye. A simple message. The truth buried under paper is still truth. The contracts are real. But if you use what's here, you use your name too. Alongside the note was a small flash drive, scratched at the edges, but clearly still working. Elias didn't even breathe. His hand shook just enough to rattle the paper. Back at his desk, eyes fixed on the screen, he clicked through the files. Dozens of scanned documents spilled open, wire transfers, hidden agreements, and deal sheets signed between Ironbank Systems, the company backing the charges against Marlene, and a shadow firm out of the Cayman Islands. It broke the case wide open. The problem was the files were tagged. Whoever sent them expected him to use them in court, but only if he stepped out from the mask he'd worn for years. By mid-afternoon, Elias was pacing in front of the library, soaked from the walk. Delilah found him shaking, hoodie clinging. To him, eyes glassy. Inside the small library meeting room, Elias collapsed into the nearest chair and let it all out. He told her how he sat for the Georgia bar under someone else's name, how he completed law school hiding behind apps and preloaded PDFs, never using his real ID. He knew the law better than he knew anything else, but outside paper, he didn't legally exist as a lawyer. If he revealed himself, the case might explode, but so could everything he'd built. Delilah didn't flinch. She sat across from him, took his hand and said quietly, "Sometimes you have to break the frame to save the picture." Her words hit softly, but they hit deep. Elias let out one long exhale. He couldn't fake it anymore, not if the truth stood a chance. He would come into the light. Whoever was pulling strings behind those papers, they were going to meet the real Elias Thornton. Word spread like brushfire the moment Elias filed the motion. It wasn't just a legal formality, it was a full-on declaration. He was asking the court to recognize him officially, retroactively, based on his clear understanding of the law and the absence of any bad faith. The paperwork was meticulous. He'd spent 2 days triple-checking every citation, referencing state bar exceptions, drawing on obscure precedent, and attaching personal records that outlined how he had mastered the system long before he ever stepped into a courtroom. But once filed, the matter left his hands. Now it belonged to the court, and everyone watching. The local news picked it up first. By that night, a loop of Elias's face was playing on repeat across 2 major Georgia channels. Interviews popped up. Some legal analysts called him a fraud, said no courtroom should honor a man who ducked protocol no matter how smart he was. Others, though, called him brave, a symbol of a system too locked behind money and pedigree. Social media split fast, hashtags trended, fans reposted snippets from the youth debate he'd crushed weeks before. Critics dug through anything they could find with his name on it. Judge Donnell, steady as ever, moved fast. Within 48 hours, she called an exceptional session at the courthouse downtown. The room was packed. Folks who'd never cared about court procedure showed up to watch something human happen inside a building, normally thick with structure and silence. Marlene sat in the front row, her hands clasped, eyes never leaving Elias as he stepped into the space reserved for formal arguments. What followed didn't look like a traditional hearing. It had pieces of a trial, parts of a job interview, and moments that felt like therapy. Delilah sat quietly behind Elias while, one by one, professors, former classmates, even a mentor from Harvard Law who flew in just for the day, stood and gave testimony. Their words weren't flowery, just clear. "He's got the kind of mind you can't teach," one said. "He's not perfect, but he understands justice better than most who hold official titles." When the ruling came down, it split the room. Judge Donnell granted the request, recognizing Elias's legitimacy as an emergency measure tied to the integrity of the case. Some people clapped, others booed, as if it were a political rally. But when Elias walked out through the side doors, his name was on legal record for the first time. He no longer stood in anyone's shadow. The badge in his pocket was real, and the fight, now fully his, was just getting started.